The Nevada plains at dusk were a wild, unruly ocean of silver grass and darkening sky, the kind of landscape where anything could happen and often did. On this particular night, a violent storm churned on the horizon, rolling black clouds across the open land like a warning from nature itself. Julia Marks zipped up her battered rain jacket, bracing herself against the first spattering drops. Most people would have packed up their cameras and called it a day, but Julia wasn't most people. For the last 12 years, she dedicated her life to capturing America's wild horses on film, sometimes at great risk to her own safety. Compassion, as much as curiosity, had kept her out here on the edge of nowhere. Just a battered Jeep, a tent, and her unshakable belief that the wild deserved its witnesses. She was reviewing footage in the glow of her laptop inside her canvas tent, the wind battering the sides, when she heard it, a shrill, panicked whinny that cut through the howl of the storm. Julia's heart leapt. She knew the voices of wild horses well, and this one was close, too close. She snatched her flashlight, boots thumping through the wet earth, and burst into the night. Rain stung her cheeks, and thunder rattled the bones of the valley. A bolt of lightning illuminated the ridge, and for a split second, Julia saw her, a wild silver Mustang, her coat gleaming in the storm, mane plastered against her muscular neck. The mare's nostrils flared as she stomped the ground, tail lashing, her eyes locked on Julia's camp, as if she had come with purpose. Julia froze. Wild horses rarely approached humans, especially not alone. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she was dreaming, but the mare's urgency was unmistakable. The Mustang whinnied again, pawing the ground, then trotted forward, too bold, too close, too desperate to ignore. Julia stepped forward, careful but unafraid, the wild horse's eyes tracking her every move. "Easy, girl," Julia murmured, her voice lost in the wind. "What are you trying to tell me?" She recognized the mare from her past weeks of filming, a striking animal she'd nicknamed Luna for the moon's silver streaks in her mane. Luna had always kept her distance, leading her band away at the first sight of humans. This night was different. Something had driven her here, and Julia could feel the tension like an electric wire stretched between them. Luna backed up a few steps, then turned her head sharply toward the distant hills, whinnying again, more insistent. She stamped her foreleg, shaking out the rain, thus Julia felt a rush of both fear and responsibility. Whatever had brought Luna here was urgent, and it was up to her to listen. She dashed back into the tent, yanking her first aid kit and her main camera bag. Her fingers shook with adrenaline as she zipped everything up, the wind nearly tearing the tent flap from her hands. She jammed her headlamp onto her forehead, then glanced at Luna. The mare was waiting, restless and dripping, her muscles bunching as if she might bolt at any moment. "All right, Luna," Julia said out loud this time, as if the wild horse could understand every word. "Show me." She followed Luna across the muddy flats, her boots sinking into slick grass. The storm hammered them both, lightning slashing the sky, thunder rolling so close it felt like the ground itself was shaking. Luna moved with frantic purpose, glancing back every few yards to be sure Julia was still following. The distance between them felt oddly intimate, like some invisible thread binding their destinies together for this one wild night. They crossed a narrow creek, Julia slipping and nearly tumbling as Luna paused, ears flicking anxiously. The trail led up a rocky slope, treacherous in the dark, but Julia pressed on, driven by the urgency in Luna's posture. At the top of the ridge, Luna whinnied sharply and took off down a faint path toward a cluster of boulders half-shielded from the worst of the rain. Julia's heart pounded. She fumbled for her camera, hitting record as she moved. Every instinct screamed that she was stepping into something huge, maybe dangerous, but her compassion drowned out her caution. Behind the boulders, in a patch of flattened grass, lay another horse, a chestnut stallion, his sides heaving, blood streaking his flanks and neck. He looked up at the sound of Julia's approach, eyes rolling white with fear. His breathing was ragged, and his legs trembled as he tried and failed to stand. "Oh God," Julia whispered, adrenaline spiking. "Hang in there, boy." Luna shoved in beside her, pressing her nose to the stallion's neck, whickering softly. The mare's loyalty was fierce, almost human in its intensity. Julia could see the stallion was badly hurt. Deep lacerations along his legs and shoulder, raw patches where the fur had been torn away. Dehydration had left his gums pale, his eyes sunken. Julia's training as a field documentarian kicked in. She set her camera on a nearby rock, angling it to capture both horses, then dropped to her knees beside the stallion. Hands steady despite the storm, she unpacked her first aid kit. She used her jacket to shield the wound from the rain, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. Luna stood so close that Julia could feel the mare's breath on her neck, as if urging her to hurry. All around them, the storm raged, but in that small circle of light, Julia felt the world narrow to 3 souls, one desperate for help, one fighting to live, and one refusing to give up. Minutes dragged by. Julia cleaned the worst of the wounds with saline, cursing the lack of better supplies. She fished a water bottle from her pack, dribbling water between the stallion's cracked lips. Luna refused to leave the stallion's side, pressing her face against his, her body blocking the wind. Julia's hands ached from the cold, but she worked quickly, driven by the urgency in Luna's every movement. The wild horse's trust, so fragile, so hard-won, made Julia feel both honored and terrified. If she failed now, she'd never forgive herself. Finally, as the rain began to slow and the thunder faded into the distance, Julia slumped back, exhausted. The stallion's breathing had steadied, though he was still weak. Luna nudged him softly, then looked at Julia. Really looked, eyes deep and ancient and full of something that felt almost like gratitude. Julia caught it all on film, every desperate moment. She knew this was only the beginning, but even now, with mud in her boots and blood on her hands, she felt hope flicker in the darkness. Sometimes, the wild didn't just ask for help, it demanded it. And tonight, Julia Marks was there to answer. The storm's rage had faded to a cold drizzle by the time Julia finished her first round of field aid. She wiped rain from her brow, breath rising in steamy plumes, mind racing with 1,000 questions and only one answer. She couldn't leave these horses out here alone. Not with the stallion in this state. She had just enough cell service to get a text out, a single, urgent plea to Dr. Michaela Chen, the closest equine vet she knew and one of the few people who would drive into the wild at this hour. But help would take time. And time, Julia realized as she watched the stallion's sides heave, was in dangerously short supply. Luna, the silver mare, pressed her head against the stallion's shoulder, almost as if willing him to stay with her. Each time the wind rattled the branches above, Luna's body tensed, eyes flicking between Julia and the path leading deeper into the hills. Her loyalty, her refusal to leave the stallion's side, kept the tension razor-sharp. Julia found herself whispering encouragement to them both. Words meant as much for herself as for the animals. Suddenly, Luna stamped her hoof and turned toward Julia, ears flattened. The message was clear. She wanted Julia to follow. For one wild moment, Julia hesitated. She'd already risked enough for one night, but the urgency in Luna's gaze was impossible to ignore. She packed her kit, slung her camera over her shoulder, and nodded. "Okay, girl, lead the way." Luna surged forward, slipping past boulders and through a tangled stand of junipers. Julia knelt next to the stallion, urging him with soft, soothing sounds as she coaxed him to rise. The chestnut's legs wobbled, hooves scraping against stone, but Luna circled back, nuzzling and encouraging until, slowly, painfully, he struggled to his feet. What followed was a tense, slow-motion trek through the battered landscape. The stallion's progress was agonizingly slow, every step a small victory. Julia flanked him on one side, her hand gentle on his withers, while Luna nudged and guided from the other. Lightning flickered over the hills, illuminating their ragged, rain-soaked procession. They wound down a narrow, rocky trail Julia hadn't noticed before, a path hidden by brush, impossible to see from the camp. Luna had chosen it with purpose. As they moved, Julia caught glimpses of old scars on the stallion's hide, the story of past hardships etched into his body. Despite the pain, he fought forward, the bond between him and Luna keeping him moving when instinct alone might have told him to give up. By the time they reached the base of the canyon, Julia's legs ached and her breath came in short bursts. The canyon itself was like a secret sanctuary, a bowl of earth protected from the worst of the wind, edged by towering stones. Here Luna stopped, her body tense and vigilant. The stallion sank to his knees, eyes glazed with exhaustion, flanks shuddering as he collapsed in the shelter of a thick cedar. Julia set to work again. The wounds on his foreleg had reopened, blood trickling in thin rivulets. She tore strips from her spare shirt to bind the worst of them, hands sticky with blood and rain. Her camera, perched on a nearby rock, recorded every movement, documenting both her actions and the raw, shivering emotion that ran through her voice. Between bandaging, she spoke softly, telling the stallion, who she now mentally named Ranger, that help was coming. She described the vet, Dr. Chen, a gentle, skilled woman who would know exactly what to do. Julia didn't know if horses could understand words, but she believed in the power of her presence, the steady beat of her heart, and the warmth in her hands. Suddenly, Ranger shied violently, nostrils flaring as a sudden crack of thunder split the air. Luna stood over him, planting herself between him and the storm, refusing to budge even as rain began to pour down again. Julia shivered, her jacket soaked through, her fingers numb, but she refused to abandon her post. After what felt like hours, headlights flickered through the trees above the canyon rim. Julia scrambled up the muddy trail, waving her flashlight in frantic circles. Relief washed over her as she saw Dr. Michaela Chen emerge from her battered truck, raincoat flapping in the wind, vet bag already in hand. "Over here," Julia called, voice hoarse. Michaela didn't waste time on greetings. She jogged after Julia, boots squelching in the mud. As soon as she saw Ranger, her face hardened with professional concern. She knelt beside him, running skilled hands over his body, murmuring to Luna as she assessed the wounds. "Severe lacerations on the leg and flank," Michaela said, voice clipped and calm. "He's dehydrated, badly. Did you get any water in him?" Julia nodded, showing the empty bottle. Michaela nodded in approval and began pulling supplies from her kit, antiseptics, bandages, a syringe of sedative. Luna watched with wild, distrustful eyes but didn't interfere, as if sensing that Michaela, too, was here to help. Working together, they cleaned and dressed the worst of the wounds. Michaela started an IV drip, threading the line into Ranger's vein with careful fingers. All the while, Julia filmed, her hands shaking with exhaustion and relief. The storm continued to mutter and spit above them, but in the small circle of light cast by their headlamps, hope glimmered. Hours crawled by. The wind eased, then faded entirely. Julia and Michaela spoke in low, urgent voices, making plans, swapping stories of other wild rescues, each tale a reminder of how close tragedy always lurked. Through it all, Luna remained a silent, steadfast presence, her body pressed to Ranger's, her eyes never leaving Julia. At last, Ranger's breathing eased. He no longer trembled with each gust of wind. Michaela checked his vitals, satisfaction flickering across her features. "He's tough," Michaela murmured, "and lucky you found him when you did." Julia nodded, feeling her own eyes burn. It wasn't me. It was her. She gestured at Luna. "She brought me here. She wouldn't let me give up." They set up a makeshift shelter, layering Julia's emergency blankets over the stallion. Michaela prepared to stay the night, monitoring Ranger's condition, administering fluids and pain relief. Julia, exhausted to her core, slumped against a rock, her camera still rolling. The storm was nearly spent. The only sounds were the slow, rhythmic breathing of the horses and the gentle, ever-watchful shuffle of Luna's hooves. In that fragile moment, the line between wild and human blurred. Julia felt the weight of Luna's trust settle over her, a sacred responsibility, a silent promise. Whatever happened next, she knew she would not, could not, walk away. Above them, the clouds began to thin, letting the first faint rays of dawn touch the canyon floor. A new day was coming, and with it, the beginning of a story no one would soon forget. Night in the canyon settled like a heavy, soft blanket, cloaking everything in a hush broken only by the quiet drip of rain from pine needles and the deep, ragged breaths of the horses. Julia huddled under her rain poncho, legs drawn to her chest, headlamp turned down to its dimmest setting. Despite the bone-deep fatigue, she could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, images from the past hours flooded her mind. Luna's desperate plea, Ranger's battered body, the wild urgency that had driven them all into this unlikely alliance beneath the battered Nevada sky. Dr. Michaela Chen moved quietly around the small shelter, her hands steady and sure. She checked Ranger's IV, monitoring the flow of fluids. Occasionally, she would kneel and place her ear against his chest, listening to the rhythm of his heart. Each time she would meet Julia's anxious eyes and nod, reassurance passing between them without a word. Luna hovered close, muscles tense beneath her damp coat. She never strayed more than a few feet from Ranger. Whenever Julia shifted or Michaela reached for new supplies, Luna would flare her nostrils, ears flicking, body angled protectively between the humans and her injured companion. But as the hours passed and nothing threatened, she began to relax. Just a little. Julia noticed that the silver mare's tail stopped its agitated swishing, and her eyes grew softer in the dim light. In that quiet, Julia finally found a moment to breathe. She drew out her battered field notebook, its pages warped by the storm, and began to write by the glow of her headlamp. She scribbled down everything, her observations of Luna's remarkable behavior, the subtle changes in Ranger's breathing, the electric charge of responsibility that had settled in her chest. She glanced at Luna, who was watching her with deep, unblinking eyes. "I wish you could tell me your story," Julia whispered, not caring that no one could hear. "You're not like any wild horse I've ever met," Michaela joined her, sitting quietly in the shadows. "Some bonds run deeper than we know. Luna's loyalty, her trust in you, isn't normal, not for a Mustang." Julia nodded, looking at the pair. "It feels like she's testing me. Like, if I pass, maybe she'll let me in." The hours dragged on. Michaela's calm, professional presence brought a sense of order to the night. She kept a careful record of Ranger's condition, adjusting his bandages and monitoring his vital signs. Julia, her exhaustion giving way to a kind of stubborn determination, alternated between filming, note-taking, and simply sitting quietly beside the horses. In the deepest part of the night, the wind stilled. Mist pooled in the low places of the canyon, and the temperature dropped. Julia shivered, teeth chattering, but she didn't move. Luna, sensing her discomfort, stepped closer, eyes fixed on Julia's face. The Mustang's breath came in visible clouds, and for a heartbeat, Julia saw a flicker of something ancient and gentle in her gaze. Ranger stirred, a low groan escaping him as he tried to lift his head. Luna was there in an instant, nuzzling his neck, her body blocking the worst of the cold breeze. Julia watched, heart aching, as the injured stallion's panic faded under Luna's gentle touch. It was as if Luna's presence alone held Ranger's fear at bay, her calm radiating outwards, making it possible for him to rest. Julia risked reaching out, slowly extending her open hand toward Luna's muzzle. She half expected the mare to shy away, but instead Luna leaned forward, nostrils quivering as she sniffed Julia's palm. The moment was brief but electrifying, a fragile spark of trust, hard-won and precious. "Thank you," Julia breathed, barely audible. The words carried no expectation, only gratitude. Michaela smiled softly in the shadows. "You've earned that, Julia. Wild horses don't give their trust easily." The rest of the night passed in fits and starts. Julia and Michaela took turns keeping vigil, dozing in brief, uneasy intervals. Ranger's breathing steadied, though he still flinched at sudden sounds. The slow drip of the IV, the steady rhythm of Luna's hooves shifting, and the low murmur of Julia's voice made a strange, peaceful symphony in the heart of the canyon. As the sky began to lighten, streaks of pale pink and gold cut through the gray. The first birds chirped from the trees above, and a breeze rustled the sagebrush. Julia stood, stretching aching limbs, and filmed the dawn as it crept into the canyon. She captured Luna, silhouetted against the rising sun, standing guard over Ranger. The scene was so beautiful, so quietly powerful, that Julia felt tears prick her eyes. Michaela knelt by Ranger, checking his wounds once more. "He's stable, weak, but stronger than before." She smiled at Julia, fatigue etched into every line of her face. "That's more than I hoped for." Julia crouched next to Luna, speaking softly. "We're going to help him, both of you, I promise." To Julia's amazement, Luna stepped forward, pressing her muzzle gently against Julia's shoulder. For a long, breathless moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the wild mare and the woman who had answered her call. Julia's heart hammered, full of awe and gratitude. The trust was real, fragile but growing, and she vowed not to betray it. The sun rose higher, painting the canyon in warm light. Ranger, still weak, managed to lift his head and nicker softly. Luna answered with a gentle whicker, brushing her nose along his flank. Julia recorded everything, the camera whirring quietly as she captured the first steps in a new chapter for both Mustangs. As the morning unfolded, Michaela helped Julia clean and rewrap Ranger's wounds. They took turns offering him sips of water, encouraging him with gentle words. Luna, no longer quite so wary, stood close by, allowing Julia to stroke her neck and even run her fingers through her tangled mane. The spark of trust became a tiny flame. By mid-morning, the world felt changed. The worst of the storm was behind them, replaced by a sense of possibility. Julia, exhausted but exhilarated, looked around the little canyon and saw not just a place of rescue, but the beginning of something bigger, a story she was now part of, one that demanded to be told. And so, As the sun bathed the canyon in light and Luna stood unafraid at her side, Julia knew they had all survived the night. But more than that, they had taken the first steps toward hope, together. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the canyon, glinting off damp rocks and throwing long golden stripes across the battered ground. Julia woke with a start, her neck stiff from dozing upright. The exhaustion from the night before clung to her bones, but the peaceful scene before her filled her with cautious hope. Ranger lay curled against Luna, his breathing steady, wounds cleaned and bandaged. Luna's ears flicked toward Julia, and for the first time, she didn't shrink away as Julia approached, camera in hand. Dr. Michaela Chen was already at work, kneeling beside Ranger, her gentle touch inspecting the healing wounds. Julia knelt beside her, documenting every movement, her lens capturing Luna's unwavering devotion to the stallion and the cautious bond that had formed between all three. As Michaela checked Ranger's injured leg, her fingers paused at a faded, irregular mark on the horse's shoulder. She leaned closer, brushing away dirt and dried blood. Julia set the camera aside and peered over her shoulder. Curiosity piqued. Michaela's brow furrowed. "Julia, take a look at this." Julia crouched lower, eyes squinting against the morning light. There, beneath a patch of matted chestnut hair, was a faint, roughly branded number. It looked like it had once been clear, but now only traces of the old mark remained. It was the unmistakable shape of a Bureau of Land Management, BLM, freeze brand, the kind issued to wild Mustangs rounded up from public lands and offered for adoption. Recognition hit Julia like a bolt of lightning. "He's an adopted Mustang, abandoned." Michaela nodded grimly. "That brand tells a story. This isn't the first time I've seen this. Horses that don't fit in, people give up, and sometimes they just turn them out again." Julia felt a wave of anger and sadness. He's lucky Luna didn't abandon him too. She probably saved his life. Michaela gave Luna an admiring glance. Horses like her don't forget their own. The implications churned in Julia's mind. She filmed close-ups of the faded brand and scribbled notes, ideas and questions bubbling up. Who had adopted Ranger? Why had he been left out here to fend for himself, injured and alone? And how many other Mustangs had suffered the same fate, invisible to the world? After Michaela was satisfied with Ranger's progress, Julia packed up her camera and first aid kit, preparing to leave for a few hours. "Can you hold down the fort?" she asked Michaela. Michaela nodded. "I'll be here. Luna and I have it covered." Julia hiked back to her battered Jeep, a few miles from the canyon. The drive into the nearest town felt surreal, her boots still muddy, her clothes stiff with dried rain, her mind looping through every detail of the past 24 hours. The town itself was a scattered grid of weathered buildings and wide, dusty roads. Julia had spent enough time here to know the locals by name, but this morning she had no time for small talk. She needed answers. Her first stop was the county records office. The woman behind the counter raised her eyebrows as Julia explained the situation. A wounded Mustang, a faded BLM brand, a mystery in need of unraveling. She helped Julia search the government database using the partial brand number Michaela had noted down. After half an hour of cross-referencing, they found a match. Ranger had been rounded up in Utah 2 years earlier and adopted by a rancher on the Nevada side of the border. Julia jotted down the details, her frustration mounting. There was no record of Ranger being returned, adopted out, or officially missing. Her next stop was the home of the rancher in question, a man named Clyde Benson. His sprawling ranch was surrounded by a rusty barbed wire fence and dotted with outbuildings, old machinery, and a small herd of cattle. Julia parked at the end of the long drive, nerves prickling. Clyde met her at the gate, suspicion in his weathered eyes. "Can I help you?" His voice was guarded, the kind of tone used for strangers with cameras. Julia introduced herself, careful to keep her voice friendly but firm. "I'm a wildlife filmmaker, and I'm documenting the plight of Nevada's wild horses. I found a Mustang. Your old BLM brand matches him. His name was Ranger in the files." Clyde's face tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about. All my horses are accounted for." Julia held her ground. "He was badly injured. Someone abandoned him in the hills. The records say you adopted him." Clyde bristled, jaw working. "Some of those horses are wild through and through. Dangerous. I tried, but he wouldn't stay put. If he got out, that's not my fault." Julia's anger simmered, but she kept it contained. If a horse is abandoned and left to die, that's not just unlucky, it's illegal. Clyde's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Julia snapped a quick photo of the ranch for her records, thanked him for his time, and left. Back in town, Julia visited the local feed store and diner, places where ranchers and townsfolk gathered. She struck up conversations, gently steering topics toward wild horses and adoption stories. Most people shrugged, but a few shared rumors of other Mustangs found wandering, some with faded brands, others with visible signs of neglect. The pattern was clear: a handful of bad actors, a system with too few safeguards, and too many horses falling through the cracks. Julia's frustration transformed into resolve. She would tell this story, shining a light on the darker side of Mustang adoptions. She recorded interviews, collected witness accounts, and even convinced one local, an elderly woman who'd adopted a Mustang years earlier, to share her own bittersweet experience. "It's not the horse's fault," she said quietly. "It's the people who give up on them. They deserve better." Returning to the canyon that evening, Julia felt the weight of a mission settling on her shoulders. She found Ranger dozing peacefully, Luna keeping guard, and Michaela warming her hands over a camp stove. "Any luck?" Michaela asked. Julia nodded. "I know who he was. I know who abandoned him. And I know we have to do something. Not just for Ranger, but for all the others." Michaela smiled, respect shining in her tired eyes. "You're a force of nature, Julia." Julia looked at Luna, who now stepped forward to greet her, nostrils brushing Julia's sleeve. The wild mare's trust, once unthinkable, now felt like a promise, one Julia intended to keep. As night fell, Julia scribbled in her notebook by lantern light, Luna and Ranger resting close. The injustice she'd uncovered fueled her determination. Tomorrow, she would bring this story to the world and fight for a future where no wild horse would be left behind. By sunrise, Julia had already begun editing her footage, her laptop propped on a flat rock at the edge of the canyon. Each clip, Luna's wild plea, Ranger's desperate struggle, Michaela's gentle care, wove together into a powerful story. But it was the shot of Ranger's faded BLM brand that brought a lump to Julia's throat every time she watched it. This was more than a rescue. It was a call to action. She uploaded a rough cut to her documentary channel, adding a heartfelt narration. "This is Ranger. He once belonged to someone. He was thrown away when life got hard. But he is not forgotten. We are his witnesses and his hope." As the video rendered, Julia's hands trembled with anticipation and dread. She knew she was about to stir the hornet's nest. By midday, the video had begun to spread. Animal welfare groups shared it, tagging Julia in posts with words like hero and Mustang guardian. Volunteers messaged her, offering supplies and donations. Even strangers from neighboring counties asked how they could help. Julia felt a cautious hope blooming inside her, fed by every kind word and offer of support. But it wasn't all gratitude. By late afternoon, Julia's inbox was flooded with angry messages. Some were from ranchers who saw her footage as an attack on their way of life, on generations-old traditions and hard-won land rights. Others accused her of sensationalizing a problem they claimed was rare or exaggerated. One message was especially blunt. "Stay out of our business. These are our horses, not yours. You don't understand what it's like." Julia tried to breathe through her frustration. She had grown up in a ranching family herself, and she understood the challenges, the droughts, the wildfires, the fierce competition for grazing land. But none of that, she thought, could justify cruelty or abandonment. Still, the backlash didn't end online. 2 days after the video went viral, Julia parked her Jeep at the edge of town and made her way to the old Civic Hall. The building was already buzzing with tension. Flyers announcing a Mustang Crisis Town Hall fluttered on the bulletin board outside. One of them defaced with red marker, "Go home, Julia." Inside, the room was packed. Ranchers in dusty boots and battered hats. Animal lovers with "Save the Mustangs" t-shirts. High school kids clutching handmade protest signs. Julia felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach as she took her seat at the front. Ranger's battered halter in her lap like a talisman. The meeting began with the mayor's attempt at diplomacy, but it quickly unraveled. An older rancher, broad-shouldered and red-faced, stood and jabbed a finger at Julia. "You're painting us all as monsters. You don't know what it's like out here. Wild horses eat up our grazing. Some of us take them in, try to help, and then get blamed when it doesn't work out." Julia waited until the anger had run its course. When the room fell quiet, she stood holding up the halter. "This is about Ranger," she said, "and Luna, and every Mustang who's been failed by the system. I know not every rancher is the problem, but if we don't face what's happening, we're all complicit." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Julia projected the video onto a makeshift screen, letting the images speak for her. The room grew silent as Luna's desperate whinnies echoed through the speakers, as Ranger's bloodied body filled the screen, as Julia's own hands worked to save him. By the time the footage ended, even the toughest ranchers looked shaken. A local teacher stood up, voice trembling. "My students watched this. They want to help. Can we do something?" A younger rancher, hat in hand, nodded. "We've seen too many Mustangs wandering. It's getting worse." But not everyone was moved. Another rancher, a friend of Clyde Benson's, stood and sneered, "This is just city folk meddling. If you don't like it, go back to California." Julia met his glare. "I was born here. I know these lands as well as anyone. And I know right from wrong. No animal should be abandoned to starve or die. We have to do better." The argument flared again, growing heated and personal. Julia's cheeks burned, but she didn't back down. The debate swung back and forth. Ranchers worried about new regulations and land use. Activists pushing for stricter enforcement and more humane treatment. Townsfolk torn between empathy and tradition. The mayor finally called for order. "Let's listen to Julia. She's not asking us to shut down ranches. She's asking us to protect the Mustangs and hold people accountable." Julia seized the chance. "I'm organizing a volunteer network. We'll patrol for abandoned horses. We'll support those willing to adopt, really adopt, not just take the government check and turn a horse loose. We'll fundraise for vet care, fencing, and training. But we can't do it alone. We need everyone." Luna and Ranger became the faces of the movement. Julia printed their photos on flyers and social media posts. Their loyalty saved a life. Will you help save more? Volunteers started to trickle in, an old cowboy with a gentle touch, a retired nurse who donated medical supplies, students eager to muck stalls or set up donation drives. The town's animal rescue filled up with blankets, feed, and halters. Still, pushback remained. Julia's Jeep was keyed outside the diner. Anonymous notes showed up at her camp. "You're not welcome here." Online, trolls sent threats and cruel memes, but Julia refused to be intimidated. Every night, she sat with Luna and Ranger in the canyon, telling them about the day's victories and defeats, letting their quiet presence remind her why she fought. And then something shifted. A family who'd once opposed the wild horse movement showed up at her camp, their young daughter clutching a drawing of Luna. The father admitted, "We didn't understand before, but we do now. We want to help." Julia's heart swelled. This was how change began, not with sweeping victories, but with small, stubborn acts of courage. She sent out another video update, inviting the whole community to the canyon for an open house. "Come meet the Mustangs. See what hope looks like." As the sun set, Julia watched Luna and Ranger grazing side by side, their scars slowly healing. The fight was far from over, but for the first time Julia felt the power of a story taking root, not just in her camera, but in the hearts of her neighbors. Tomorrow would bring more conflict. But tonight, in the company of survivors, Julia believed that justice was possible, and that the sanctuary she dreamed of was already beginning, right here in the wild, uncertain heart of Nevada. The aftermath of the town hall lingered in the air like the scent of rain after a storm, hope mingled with tension, and the future of the Mustangs hanging in the balance. Julia woke before dawn every day, driven by the same restless energy that had carried her through Ranger's first desperate hours. But now, with the community's eyes on her and the stakes rising, she felt the weight of every decision and every risk. Her mornings started in the canyon. Luna greeted her quietly, now more comfortable with Julia's presence, sometimes nosing her camera bag as if checking for treats. Ranger's wounds healed steadily under Michaela's supervision, though the stallion remained cautious with strangers. These small victories brought comfort, but Julia knew she was fighting a larger battle, one that required proof, persistence, and a willingness to face powerful adversaries. Michaela joined Julia one chilly morning, clipboard in hand. "We have a real chance here, Julia," she said, crouching to check Ranger's leg. "But it won't be easy. Animal neglect cases never are." Julia nodded. "I'm not letting this go, not after what Ranger and Luna have survived. If we don't push for justice now, what's to stop this from happening again?" Michaela agreed. Together, they contacted the county animal welfare officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Deputy Carla Ruiz, who arrived at the canyon to document Ranger's condition and take an official statement. Julia showed her the footage, the close-up of Ranger's BLM brand, and the interviews she'd gathered from neighbors and volunteers. Deputy Ruiz took careful notes, her expression serious as she examined every angle. "This isn't the first abandoned Mustang we've heard about," Ruiz said, voice tight with frustration. "But having you as a witness, having video proof and expert testimony from Dr. Chen, changes things. We might finally have a case strong enough to move forward." Word spread quickly. Julia's documentary updates, paired with Michaela's detailed vet reports, put mounting pressure on local authorities. The county sheriff, initially skeptical, found himself fielding calls from journalists, animal rights advocates, and even state legislators who'd seen the viral rescue video. The case was no longer just a small-town problem. It was a public spotlight. Not everyone was happy about the attention. Julia began to notice strange cars idling near her camp late at night, headlights sweeping across her tent before vanishing down the dirt road. Online, the threats grew uglier. "You're ruining lives over a horse," one anonymous message spat. "Leave before you get hurt." Her phone rang with blocked numbers, silent on the other end. Despite the fear, Julia refused to back down. She doubled her efforts, working with Michaela and Deputy Ruiz to gather every shred of evidence. They took photos of the canyon, cataloged the wounds Ranger had suffered, and mapped out the likely path he'd traveled from Clyde Benson's ranch. Michaela wrote a sworn affidavit about Ranger's injuries, how they couldn't have happened naturally, how neglect and abandonment had nearly killed him. Ruiz, fueled by her own sense of justice, began digging into local records. She discovered 2 other BLM Mustangs adopted by the same rancher had disappeared from county rolls over the past year. Julia's heart pounded as she read the reports. No sign of the horses, no formal returns, just paperwork trailing off into silence. "Clyde Benson's been doing this for a while," Ruiz muttered. "If we can prove a pattern, we might not just save Ranger, we could shut him down for good." The investigation hit walls at every turn. Benson refused to answer questions, his lawyer threatening Julia and Michaela with harassment suits. Some townsfolk, wary of outsiders and government interference, stopped talking to Julia entirely. A local newspaper ran a piece defending Benson, painting Julia as a radical activist with a camera and an agenda. But Julia's resolve only hardened. She used the backlash as fuel, recording a new video that laid out the facts, the law, and the stakes. "We're not just fighting for Ranger. We're fighting for every Mustang who's been thrown away, forgotten, or left to suffer. The law protects them, but only if we make it work." Her supporters rallied. Volunteers from nearby counties joined patrols, searching for other abandoned Mustangs in the hills. A retired judge offered pro bono legal advice. Donations poured in from across the country, enough to pay for supplies, vet bills, and even a portable security camera system to keep watch over the camp. The day Deputy Ruiz returned with a warrant was one Julia would never forget. The sheriff's deputies, serious and quiet, drove out to Benson's ranch and searched the property. They found evidence of neglect, old feed bags, unused medication, and traces of horses long gone. Benson was arrested, his face thunderous with rage as news crews captured the moment on film. Still, the legal fight was just beginning. Benson's lawyers filed countersuits, accusing Julia and Michaela of trespassing and defamation. Online trolls escalated their attacks, spreading rumors and doctored photos. Julia's camp was vandalized one night, her tent slashed and her car's tires flattened. The fear was real, and so was the exhaustion, but Julia refused to let it drive her away. Michaela, standing by Julia as they surveyed the damage, squeezed her arm. "You're not alone. You've started something, Julia, something that matters." Julia nodded, eyes shining. "For Luna, for Ranger, for every Mustang that needs us." The next day, Julia received a letter from a senator's office in Carson City. "Your story is being heard," it read. "Let's discuss how we can strengthen protections for Nevada's wild horses." She sat in stunned silence, the page trembling in her hands. That evening, Julia filmed Luna and Ranger at dusk. She spoke directly to the camera. "There are people who want us to be silent, to let things go back to the way they were. But silence never saved anyone. Every step forward, every voice, every action matters, for them and for us." As the sun set over the canyon, Julia felt both fear and hope warring inside her. The fight was far from over, but the path forward was clear. She had learned that real change was hard, slow, and often dangerous, but it was also possible if you refused to look away. The wild was watching, and Julia was ready to answer, no matter the cost. The Nevada sun returned with an almost forgiving warmth, drying the muddy canyon and painting everything in gold. For Julia, the days following Benson's arrest blurred into a whirlwind of action. Meetings with volunteers, conference calls with animal welfare groups, and endless documentation for the ongoing legal case. Yet, amid the struggle, a new current of hope pulsed through the community, inspired by the story of Luna and Ranger. The once hidden canyon, once just a place of rescue and fear, was about to become something more. A true sanctuary. It started with an idea as fragile as Ranger's first steps. What if Julia turned her family's neglected ranch, lying a few miles from the canyon, into a safe haven for abandoned Mustangs? She shared her vision with Michaela over mugs of strong coffee. The map of the old property spread out between them. The land had once teemed with cattle and laughter, but it had sat mostly silent since Julia's parents passed away. "We could do this," Julia said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Build something that lasts, something for Luna, for Ranger, and every Mustang like them." Michaela grinned, squeezing her hand. "You've got a whole army behind you now. Let's get to work." The next morning, Julia posted a video update, a heartfelt appeal for help. "We have land, but we need hands. Fencing, shelter, medical stalls. We need this to be a place where horses heal, and people too." She showed viewers the overgrown pastures and crumbling barns, then turned the camera on Luna and Ranger, now healthy enough to graze side by side in the morning light. Within days, the response was overwhelming. Donations of lumber, fencing supplies, and hay arrived, some from strangers across the state. Volunteers showed up, old ranchers who remembered Julia's parents, young couples eager to help, families with curious children in tow. A team of local carpenters donated their Saturdays to repair the barn roof. Teens from the high school painted signs, "Sanctuary of Second Chances, Wild Hearts Welcome." The transformation was grueling, beautiful work. Julia threw herself into every task, her body aching by nightfall, but her heart buoyed by the sense of purpose. She mucked out stalls alongside a retired nurse who could wield a pitchfork as well as she dressed wounds. Michaela organized the medical area, setting up a clean space for emergencies and recovery. Every person who arrived brought their own story. Some had lost horses before. Others just wanted to feel useful. Luna and Ranger became the heart of the sanctuary. On the first afternoon the fences were complete. Julia led the pair from the canyon to the ranch, Luna trotting confidently ahead, Ranger close behind. The volunteers gathered at the gate, holding their breath as Julia opened it wide. "Go on," she murmured. "Welcome home." Luna pranced into the pasture, head high, mane glinting. Ranger followed at a more cautious pace, but when Luna circled back to nudge him, he let out a soft, joyous nicker. The crowd broke into applause, some wiping tears from their eyes. From that day, the sanctuary grew almost as if the land itself was waking up. New arrivals soon followed. A battered Palomino mare rescued from a nearby valley, a pair of yearlings found wandering the roadside, another stallion with scars and a wary gaze. Each horse arrived frightened and uncertain, but Luna and Ranger greeted them with quiet acceptance, guiding them to water and shelter, standing by as they trembled and sniffed the air. Julia watched these first introductions with a mix of awe and relief. She filmed every moment, narrating in a voice choked with emotion. Here, pain is met with kindness. Every new arrival brings their fear and their story, but they are never alone. The volunteers grew into a family. They ate together at long tables set up in the shade, swapping stories and laughter as the sun dipped low. Children helped gather wildflowers for the horses' stalls. Local businesses donated feed and tools. Even the sheriff's office sent deputies to install better lighting and security, a quiet promise that the sanctuary would be protected from those who wished it harm. But it wasn't always easy. There were setbacks, storms that toppled fences, a case of colic that had everyone up all night, rumors that another rancher was threatening to file a lawsuit against Julia for encouraging trespassing Mustangs. Julia learned to weather each challenge, her resolve hardening. She called late-night strategy sessions with Michaela, reaching out to animal welfare attorneys and Mustang advocacy groups for guidance. Despite the obstacles, something extraordinary began to happen. The sanctuary, once just an idea, became a place of visible healing. Ranger, once on the edge of death, now limped across the field to greet visitors, his scars a badge of survival. Luna became a mentor to the frightened new arrivals, often sleeping with her body pressed protectively against those who needed comfort. Word spread fast. Local schools arranged field trips, teachers eager to show students what hope and resilience looked like in real life. Some of the children were troubled, carrying wounds invisible to the world, but they seemed to find peace brushing the Mustangs or sitting quietly beside them. One day, Julia filmed a young girl, silent and withdrawn, smiling for the first time as Luna nudged her hand with a velvet nose. Julia edited together a new documentary segment, capturing the sanctuary's transformation, the pounding of fence posts. The first night the barn lights shone out across the dark fields, Luna and Ranger leading their small herd beneath a spray of stars. She sent it out with a simple message. This is what second chances look like. That night, as she sat on the porch watching Luna and Ranger beneath the moon, Julia felt the enormity of what they'd built. The pain and danger of the past months had become the bedrock for something stronger. A sanctuary not just for Mustangs, but for everyone who needed a place to belong. As summer settled on the Nevada plains, Julia realized that she and her wild family had not just survived. Together, they had transformed pain into purpose and created a legacy of hope that would ripple far beyond the fence line. Summer on the Nevada plains settled in with a hush, broken only by the soft whinnies of Mustangs and the laughter of children drifting from the sanctuary's gates. In just a few short months, Julia's dream had blossomed into a living, breathing haven, not just for abandoned horses, but for people too. Each day brought new faces, some familiar, some strangers from towns miles away, all drawn by the promise of hope and a second chance. Early mornings saw volunteers already at work. The hum of activity began with the sunrise, students filling water troughs, retirees mucking stalls, Michaela leading a line of children down the main path, teaching them how to approach a Mustang with respect. Luna and Ranger, now recognized as the heart of the sanctuary, greeted every visitor, their gentleness easing fears and their presence a living symbol of survival. Julia had never felt such purpose. She moved through each day with her camera in hand, capturing moments she'd once only dreamed about. There was the boy from the next town over, eyes wary, who'd struggled in school but found patience and pride in caring for a rescued filly. There was the single mother who'd volunteered just for the extra food basket, then found herself staying late, telling stories to the horses in the glow of evening. And there was Michaela, steady and unflappable, whose tireless efforts saved not just horses but spirits worn thin by the world's cruelties. But it wasn't only individuals who changed. The community, once divided by suspicion and resentment, began to shift. The sanctuary became a place where differences melted away, where a rancher and an animal advocate might find themselves hammering a fence post side by side, talking about weather or football or the hard choices every life demands. One Saturday, the sanctuary held its first open house. Julia barely recognized her own ranch, transformed with banners painted by children, "Welcome, wild ones," and tables groaning with food donated by local businesses. A group of high schoolers led guided tours, explaining the history of the Mustangs, showing off the new medical barn, and sharing Luna's now famous story. Visitors, young and old, fed horses slices of apples, brushed tangled manes, and listened to Julia tell how Luna's desperate plea had sparked it all. Midday, as the sun blazed overhead, Julia gathered the crowd for a special moment. She invited up Ranger, now strong and steady, his once faded eyes shining with health. With the help of the smallest children, Julia removed the last of his bandages, revealing healed skin and new hair growing where wounds once gaped. The applause that followed wasn't just for the horse. It was for every victory, every act of kindness, every heart that had refused to give up. Media outlets took notice. Local news teams filmed segments at the sanctuary, and Julia's documentary clips went viral, showing wild horses learning to trust, volunteers hugging muddy children, and Luna standing protectively over a trembling newcomer. Soon, schools across Nevada reached out, teachers wanting to bring students, principals hoping to build empathy programs based on the sanctuary's success. The sanctuary's growing influence brought new challenges. Julia found herself at town council meetings, advocating for funding, fending off critics who claimed wild horses still threatened ranch lands. But now, she had an army of supporters at her side. Parents who'd seen their troubled teens thrive, veterans who'd found peace grooming the horses, neighbors who'd once grumbled but now dropped off feed and supplies. One evening, as dusk painted the sky, Julia filmed a special scene, a therapy session for veterans suffering from PTSD. Luna stood in a quiet corner, allowing a burly, tattooed man to rest his forehead against her neck, his hands trembling until her calm presence eased his breath. Across the pasture, a group of children with autism sat in a circle, Ranger lying beside them, his gentle eyes blinking in the golden light. These moments, wordless, profound, became the backbone of Julia's next documentary chapter. She titled it "Healing Together." The story wove between hardship and hope, focusing not only on the horses' journeys, but on the transformation of people who came to help, only to find themselves changed in return. As Julia edited the footage late into the night, she realized this was what true sanctuary meant. Not escape from the world, but facing it and mending its broken parts one gentle touch at a time. The impact grew beyond the ranch. Neighboring towns launched Mustang protection clubs, with students running bake sales to support the cause. A school district invited Julia and Michaela to speak about compassion and the cost of indifference. The sheriff's office, once skeptical, now worked alongside volunteers to report abandoned horses and enforce stricter adoption standards. Julia's fight had sparked a movement, its roots spreading wide and deep. One day, a busload of students from Las Vegas arrived, their eyes wide as they stepped off into the dusty sunlight. Some had never seen a horse up close, but by day's end, they left covered in dirt and smiles, promising to share what they'd learned. Every living thing deserves a second chance. That night, the sanctuary held a bonfire under the stars. Volunteers, neighbors, and newcomers gathered with guitars and old stories, their laughter rising into the summer air. Luna and Ranger grazed nearby, the herd growing around them, no longer fearful but whole. Julia looked around at the faces lit by firelight, children who had found a place to belong, adults who had rediscovered meaning, horses whose scars no longer defined them. In that glow, she realized the sanctuary had become more than she had dared hope. It was a living testament to resilience, to the power of compassion, to what could happen when a community chose healing over division. She closed her eyes, listening to the wild horse's soft nickers and the gentle thrum of life all around. The journey was not over, and there would be more battles to fight. But tonight, under the Nevada sky, Julia knew the community had grown not just in numbers, but in heart. Late summer draped the Nevada plains in a golden haze, the air humming with insects, the sanctuary's pastures thick with the soft thud of hooves and the low murmur of voices. The ranch, once a patchwork of old wood and hope, had become a place of constant motion and quiet miracles. Still, as the season ripened, Julia found herself drawn to the quieter moments, compelled to capture the lessons the wild had whispered to her through Luna, Ranger, and the lives they'd touched. The days were long, but it was in the hush of early morning and the lingering light of dusk that Julia felt most reflective. She often sat outside the barn, notebook in hand, watching as Luna led her growing herd through the dew-soaked grass. Ranger, once so broken, had become a pillar, his presence calming the flightiest new arrivals, his scarred body a living testament to survival. One dawn, as she filmed Luna nuzzling a trembling colt rescued just days earlier, Julia found herself narrating not just the horse's stories, but her own. The camera, perched on a fence post, caught her speaking softly, voice nearly lost in the rising wind. "The wild teaches us in ways words can't always hold," she said, standing vigil, refusing to give up. "These are the acts that heal not just broken bodies, but broken spirits. The Mustangs trust slowly, if at all, but when they do, it's a gift earned by patience and courage. I've learned that healing takes time. Sometimes it takes a lifetime, but every moment matters." She turned the camera toward the field, focusing on Luna's gentle persistence as she coaxed the nervous colt to eat. "Luna reminds me daily that trust is a fragile, living thing. You can't demand it. You can only show up again and again, even when it seems hopeless." Michaela joined her on the fence rail, boots muddy, face flushed from a morning spent treating a rescued yearling. She sat in silence, watching the herd, then quietly offered her own reflection. "These horses, they don't care about our titles, our histories, or our mistakes. They sense what's inside. That's why they save us, too. We come to help, but we leave healed in ways we didn't expect." Julia smiled, scribbling the words down for her documentary script. The sanctuary, she realized, had become more than a safe haven. It was a crucible, a place where pain, failure, and hope were melted down and reforged into something resilient and true. She'd seen hardened men softened by a horse's need, frightened children grow brave under Luna's watchful eye, and people at the edge of despair find purpose in even the smallest act of care. The deeper lessons came not just from triumphs, but from failures. Julia remembered the young mare lost to illness despite their best efforts, the rescue attempts that ended in heartbreak, the nights she'd wept alone, fearing she wasn't enough. She'd learned that courage didn't always mean victory. Sometimes it meant showing up for the next try, and the next, and the next, even after loss. She included these hard truths in her film, refusing to sugarcoat the reality of rescue. In a moving voiceover, she explained, "There's no magic fix for wounds that run deep. But I've seen what's possible when we refuse to turn away. The quiet acts, the night vigils, the gentle words, the willingness to listen. Those are what save lives, both human and animal." Julia reached out to the schools that had visited, inviting students to submit their own reflections. Dozens of essays poured in. Stories of facing fear, learning patience, and the slow, sweet victory of gaining a Mustang's trust. One boy wrote, "I used to think being brave was being loud. Now I know it's being gentle." A teenage girl confessed, "I stopped hurting myself when I started helping Ranger. He needed me to keep trying, so I did. Inspired, Julia began working with local teachers and counselors to develop an educational program built around the sanctuary's values: compassion, responsibility, and resilience. She invited at-risk youth to spend weekends at the ranch, pairing them with horses whose scars matched their own. Together, they learned that healing wasn't a straight line, but a winding trail with setbacks and sudden, breathtaking progress. The sanctuary's reach grew. A neighboring town passed a new ordinance to strengthen legal protections for wild horses, citing Julia's work and Ranger's story as inspiration. At the state level, policymakers called Julia to testify, her words helping to draft legislation that would make abandonment and neglect of Mustangs a felony. Julia's hands shook as she stood before the committee, but she spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had watched hope, quite literally, pull itself up from the dirt. Privately, Julia reflected on how her own heart had changed. She had always believed in justice, in standing up for the voiceless, but she had not realized how much she needed the wild's forgiveness too. The Mustangs, in their acceptance of her, however slow and tentative, had taught her to forgive herself for past mistakes and failures. One twilight, as the herd grazed quietly, Luna approached Julia and laid her head against Julia's shoulder, sighing. In that moment, Julia felt years of regret and uncertainty lift. She stroked Luna's silky neck, whispering, "Thank you, girl, for trusting me, for teaching me how to stay." For the closing chapter of her documentary, Julia sat at her desk, the sanctuary's nighttime sounds humming through the open window, and recorded her final narration. Healing takes time, trust, and the courage to face hard truths. Every rescued life is a victory, but the real miracle is what happens to all of us, the rescuers and the rescued, when we refuse to give up. We learn that even in a world that so often forgets its wild hearts, hope grows, sometimes quietly, sometimes against all odds, but always if we choose to stand together. Julia clicked save, closed her laptop, and walked out to join the herd beneath the vast Nevada stars. The lessons of the wild would stay with her forever, written not only in words or films, but in the daily living story of the sanctuary, a story that was still, with every sunrise, just beginning. The year turned, and with it, the wild Nevada wind brought signs of autumn. Golden cottonwoods lining the creek, a gentle hush settling over the pastures, the Mustang's coats thickening for winter. Julia stood at the fence as the sun rose over the sanctuary of second chances, the air shimmering with a quiet promise. The journey that began with a desperate cry in the storm had become something greater than anyone could have imagined. The sanctuary thrived, its impact rippling far beyond the boundaries of Julia's family ranch. The herd had grown, Luna and Ranger at the heart of it, joined by mares, foals, and stallions from every kind of hardship. The pastures rang with the sounds of healing, Mustangs galloping, children's laughter, the peaceful hum of community in motion. Each horse bore scars, but within the sanctuary, those scars became stories, lessons, and sometimes unexpected gifts. Julia found herself more a steward than a rescuer now. Her role had shifted from crisis to guidance, from emergency to nurturing growth. With Michaela and a team of new staff and volunteers, she oversaw programs that reached deep into the community: equine therapy for troubled youth and veterans, school field trips, educational workshops, and support for responsible Mustang adoptions across Nevada. One bright Saturday morning, the sanctuary hosted an event for families whose children struggled with trauma and loss. Julia watched from the barn as Luna and Ranger moved quietly among the visitors, their calm presence working magic on anxious parents and uncertain children. A young boy, silent since his father's death, brushed Ranger's neck and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." His mother cried softly behind him, the first tears of hope she'd shed in months. Veterans found solace here too. The sanctuary partnered with a local VA hospital, welcoming small groups of men and women carrying invisible wounds. The horses listened without judgment, letting themselves be led, brushed, and embraced by those who knew too well the cost of survival. "Out here," one veteran told Julia, "you can finally breathe. The wild doesn't care about medals or mistakes. It just asks you to be present." The ripple effect was profound. Julia's documentary aired on public television, drawing new supporters and volunteers from across the country. Donations arrived with notes, for Luna and Ranger, for every wild heart, for second chances. Lawmakers visited, standing awkwardly in dusty boots as Julia explained how a single act of compassion, listening to a desperate mare refusing to look away, had changed not only a handful of lives, but entire systems. Inspired by the sanctuary's work, Nevada's state legislature introduced sweeping new protections for wild horses. Abandonment and neglect became prosecutable offenses, and the BLM's adoption policies were reformed to include stricter follow-up and community-based checks. Julia testified at the hearings, her voice strong and clear, bolstered by footage of Luna, Ranger, and the many horses saved since that first stormy night. Other states followed Nevada's lead, reaching out for guidance, seeking to replicate the sanctuary's model, pairing at-risk youth and veterans with Mustangs, building networks of volunteers, raising public awareness about the plight of wild horses. Julia fielded emails and calls from all corners of the country, sometimes overwhelmed but always grateful. The movement had grown larger than her, larger than the sanctuary. It was a legacy of hope, written in every second chance granted, every heart changed by the wild's resilience. Through it all, Julia never lost sight of the sanctuary's original spirit. She walked the pastures each morning, rain or shine, checking on every horse, greeting every volunteer, finding time to pause and watch the sunrise with Luna at her side. On quiet evenings, she sat with Ranger beneath the cottonwoods, listening to the gentle night sounds and reflecting on how far they had all come. The closing scene of her documentary was filmed at dusk, a golden Nevada sky, the herd grazing peacefully, children's laughter echoing across the fields. Julia's voice carried over the images, calm and sure. No matter how lost, every life deserves a second chance. The wild reminds us, healing is possible, even when scars run deep. When we listen, act, and refuse to turn away, hope grows, even in the wildest hearts. The documentary ended with a call to action, as Julia faced the camera, Luna standing behind her, Ranger cropping grass a few feet away. If you're watching this, you are part of the story. Maybe you've never met a wild horse. Maybe you've never known what it's like to feel lost or forgotten. But all of us, in some way, need sanctuary. Somewhere we are seen, somewhere we are believed in, somewhere our second chance begins. Be that place for someone. Stand up for the voiceless, the wounded, the wild at heart. Share their stories. Support those who fight for hope. Like, subscribe, and share this story so together we can make second chances the rule, not the exception. As the credits rolled, the sanctuary glowed in the twilight. Fences secure, barns warm, horses safe, people forever changed. And as the stars blinked awake over the Nevada plains, Julia felt the wild within her settle at last. The legacy of hope was no longer just a dream. It was alive, running strong and free. A promise kept for every soul, human and horse, who dared to believe in the power of second chances.